Her Excellency Dr. Imani, PhD Rector.
Your Excellencies, Vice Rectors, distinguished visitors, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this lecture on cultural realization, and it's my special privilege to introduce the lecturer, Mr. Egbert Schramm, who specializes in making the complex understandable, making the what we do not understand understandable, a skill I think we're all keen to share in. He does this by focusing on pragmatic solutions, and his focus today is the Saudi Vision 2030. Mr. Schramm.
Good morning, everybody. It's an honor to be invited here to speak. And in the coming 1 hour, I will take you through a few insights on where does cultural knowledge enable you as an organization, as a country, to go along in time, take into account different perspectives. My name, as mentioned, is Egbert Schramm. I'm a Dutch native, although I live in Finland. So as such, I encounter intercultural differences on a day-to-day basis with my own family, which is partly Dutch, partly Finnish. I head a global cross-cultural and organizational culture consultancy, which was founded with the support of, you could say, one of the ground layers of comparative cultural analytics, Professor Dr. Hofstede. Our organization as such has one goal, and that is to make a rather academic topic, which culture has for a long time been, very applicable in our daily lives. Whether that is in growing a university with a more diverse base of students or staff, or an organization that is expanding internationally, or even domestically is increasing the employment of more foreigners. Culture plays a role in all these instances. And in the coming hour, I'll try to take you through a few of these examples. As an organization, we operate in more than 45 countries globally, and our clients include governments, include educational facilities, include business. So we work across the spectrum. And that has a reason, and that is because in today's society, none of these, call it vertical silos, operates alone. What we do in the academic environment impacts business life. What we do in business life impacts academic life. And for a proper understanding of the interlink between these two, understanding also the different contexts in which we teach and in which we practice is, I would say, quite critical. If we talk about Hofstede, then we go back to the late 60s, early 70s, where until that point, culture was a rather abstract concept. It wasn't measured in numbers. It was measured in philosophies. So what Hofstede did in the late 60s, early 70s was to conduct a research among 116,000 employees within the IBM organization, in total roughly 70 countries, whereby because all the participants were working in the same company, it was as close as a matched sample you can get. So although we are talking social science, it was as valid as social science can basically ever become in terms of research base. 1973 to 2018, it's a long time. So when we talk about the validity of cultural differences, the question begs, are these results still valid? And that's why over the last 40 plus years, the study has been repeated in numerous instances, in numerous contexts, and if we take the results of a meta-study towards Hofstede's work in 2015, then yes, the dimensions themselves in terms of the paradigm still is as valid as it was 40 years ago, still today. That's not to say that there are not any cultural dynamics changing, and we can see that the more urbanized societies become, the more wealthy societies become, that cultural programming is impacted. And we'll talk a bit more about that later on. What you see in front of you is a roadmap of cultural studies that has been conducted. It's important to understand that there's a difference between the two layers that you see in front of you. There is why we feel how we feel, our values, which have been instilled by us, by our parents and by our teachers. And then there's what we do, our practices. And that is where organizational culture or company culture comes into play. How do we work? Why do we work? And I'll talk more about this interaction in a few moments. Although we are a commercial organization, we derive our validity by staying academically relevant. Now, as most of you will have probably experienced in real life, is that there seems to be a bit of a cut between business life on one hand and academic life on another hand. And often these two silos don't talk, which results into lots of bodies of knowledge, but surprisingly little application of that knowledge in practice. And this is where we as an organization try to build a bridge. Conduct the academic studies, but do them in such a way that in daily life we can actually apply the findings. And I'll give you some examples later on. Why is this important for organizational development? Because often if we look at how we recruit, for example, our organizational leaders, whether that be within a university context or business context, we look at only a few of the circles you see behind me. We look at technical competency. For example, how many papers have you published? We look at leadership capability, and there obviously we'll use the normal leadership competency frameworks. But what you do, and how you do it, and how you communicate about what you do, is dependent in terms of effectiveness on the cultural context in which you speak, the cultural context in which you practice. And quite surprisingly, this is often the part where things fail, and also the part that is most neglected, because culture is intangible, unless you make it measurable. And that's what I'll talk more about later. Think for a moment about communication. When you think about communication, you have a certain intention with saying what you say. Point being is that only you are aware of that intention. It is very difficult for most of us to be aware about what is the behavior that follows my intention, so my personal behavior, and what is the impact that that behavior by myself has on the people that I interact with. If we look the other way around, the people that you interact with are not aware most of the time about what is the intention you have with the behavior you show, the language you use, and the way in which you speak. But what we can feel is the behavior itself and the impact it has on us. This is where, to a large extent, an element such as culture shock comes into play. And this is a biological reaction. And what is our biological reaction to things that are weird, that are different? It is to get into the fight or flight mode. And what's the challenge with that? Is that it's an automated reaction. Now, when you're in a management position, or leadership position, the challenge is to take a step back from the emotion, analyze why am I feeling the way I'm feeling right now, and most importantly, how can I leverage that? So our approach to culture is, you could call it rather utilitarian. It's not about good or bad, it's about does it work or does it not? And for those of you that have followed biological classes, we as humans don't typically tend to think when we breathe. We don't tend to think when we walk. It comes automatically. And when you get confronted with these strange things, people that look different, people that act different, people that speak different, you basically have these type of reactions in terms of you might feel amused, you might feel a bit angry because you think people are a bit silly. And the end result is typically, in these situations, we become more competitive, or we give up, or we basically start helping people. Obviously, personality plays a bit of a role here. The task of any culturally competent manager, leader, from our practical experience, is to be aware of what is happening and take that step back. Look at the bigger picture and leverage the differences. Don't get emotionally engaged with them. Now, that sounds quite clinical, and it's not easy. It takes a lot of practice for most of us. How do we react to people that act differently? Typically, we tend to think that, hey, you're not supposed to do this, not supposed to be this way. So you basically think that, okay, you might be not understanding. If it happens continuously, the thinking goes beyond that. And then you think, okay, you're now being not honest. And that's a strong emotion. It takes active consideration and thinking to consider the possibility that perhaps people come from a different set of rules. They've been educated differently, they've been raised differently. Just think for yourself, if you're an accountant and you work together with engineers, they're weird. Now bring in salespeople, they're even weirder. Well, that's because we've been trained in different ways. So yes, it might be weird, but that's not the question. The question is, how can I use the differences to bring people together with different ways of thinking, different ways of speaking, different ways of acting to create a stellar team? That's the magic. Now, the funny thing here is, if you think about the region, people tend to think, okay, we're all either Arabic or Islamic, so we must be the same. Now, if you come from Saudi Arabia and you work together with Egyptians, you will understand they're not quite the same. Or if you would go to Dubai, to the Emirates, or if you go to any other country in the region, we think they should be the same. And that's when surprises hit us even harder. Because the assumption that we're similar creates an even stronger emotional response when we're confronted with a difference. And for those of you who will start interacting with, for example, the Nordics or the Benelux, don't confuse language similarities with value similarities. These are two very different things. And again, we think we might speak the same language, but do we understand? For those of you that are new to these two models, I'll walk you through them shortly. National culture touches upon 6 social dilemmas that every society on earth faces. The first one is, how do we deal with hierarchy? Do we accept differences or do we not accept differences? The second is about, how do we relate to the group? Do we have a responsibility morally to also take care of an extended part of our family? Or is it only basically my direct partner and my own kids? The third has nothing to do with gender, but has everything to do with sources of motivation. What motivates us? Is it material success, achievement? Or is it caring for the underdog, sympathy for the underdog, the welfare state? The fourth dilemma has to do with, how do we deal with not knowing things? Do we feel very at ease with it? Or do we try to research a lot, investigate a lot, before we ever get into that situation? Just as a quick test, if we take this dimension and we think about Brexit, where do you think the UK scores? From the laughter, I can imagine your answer. The UK scores low on this dimension because they have no idea what they're doing. They make it up on the go. Might be weird, but at the same time, there is also a positive element to that behavior, which is that people can adapt very easily because they make it up on the go. So every dimension has pros and cons. The fifth dimension has a lot to do with, how do we relate to concepts of time and technology failing. Okay, it's working again. So, if we think about this dimension, for those of you that have interacted a lot with Asian countries, you might have run into this dimension. Because in Asia, everything depends on context and on time. And that means there is never a black and white. It always depends. Whereas in the Middle East, but also in, for example, the US, things are black and white. It's either good or bad. Now this has a consequence with how do we set targets? How do we basically talk about what is right and wrong? The sixth dimension has much to do with how do we relate to pleasure? Are we allowed to indulge ourselves, or do we feel that there are certain social constraints that dictate how we should behave? And here the US, for example, is on the far end of the indulgence side, because people do whatever they want, whenever they want. The important part is that there is no right and wrong. There is just difference. The question is, how do we use it and when? And that comes with an organizational context, because in organizations we don't talk about values as such, we talk about practices. How do we do the things we do? We talk about what is more important, the goal or the road to the goal. So what we do or how we do it. We talk about where do we get our impulses from? Is that from our clients or from ourselves? Short test. Apple, the iPhone company. Please raise your hand if you think that they are on the internally oriented side. Please raise your hand if they are on the external side. So most of you think they're in the middle. The point with Apple is that Apple typically doesn't do consumer research. They create the market, very internally driven. Why did Nokia have issues? Because they were way too externally driven. They had 20, 30, 40 different models. Every sub-segment in the civilization had a particular phone. Well, we all know what happened to Nokia. So this dimension has a big impact on the business model you choose. If you choose scalability, becoming client-oriented will basically terminate your business, because every adaptation costs time and money. And in a scalable business model, those are two commodities you don't have. The third dimension is about how do we control the way people do their work. If we talk about innovation, typically innovation thrives when there is relatively little control. But what happens when you do innovation in a research lab? Or what happens when you do innovation in an environment whereby a mistake can basically cause an explosion? How do you balance the level of easiness versus control? There is no right answer. It depends on the company and that part of the company involved. If we talk about the fourth dimension, it's about learning organizations. If an organization focuses on loyalty towards the own team, loyalty towards the own boss, it is detrimental to learning. Because learning takes along a more critical attitude. Now the question is, if we want to have an extremely professional organization, an organization where it's all about learning, what's the downside of that? The downside is that people no longer show any loyalty towards the organization, only loyalty towards the profession. What does that mean? Well, if you run a law firm or an accountancy firm, it means that if you're extremely professional in terms of everything from the content of the job, is that you will have issues with retention of personnel. So again here, left or right, it's not the question. The question is, where do I need to be, given my strategy, given my business, given my context? Fifth dimension, we all read or have read about data breaches. We all read about the Netflix culture or the Google culture, and it's fantastic to be open. The downside of openness is that people take data security a lot less serious. So again, there's a trade-off with how open do you need to be given your strategy. How open do you need to be given to quickly onboard new people? If you have a lot of retention, it takes people 2-3 years to feel at home. Typically, they're already gone again. So again, a strategic challenge. Sixth dimension is more of a philosophical question for management. Do we believe that if we take well care of people, they will do the best for the organization? Or do we believe that we need to push people to get the best out of them? The up or out type of culture. Most big consulting companies work with an up or out culture, but they do that with a strategy, which is to spread their alumni to the businesses that will then hire them. If we think about companies like Google or Apple, we think they might be employee-oriented because there is coffee at the company, there's massages at the company, there's gyms at the company. But what are they actually doing? They lock you in. You have no life outside the company. So what we see and what is actually being done are two different things, and that's the strategic consideration. What do we need to do? Now, summarizing it, culture is about the collective programming, and it's about group differences. So it's also important to understand what can we impact when. The values in terms of how do we deal with hierarchy, how do we deal with the group, these are set in stone by the time we're 12, 15 years of age. Because by that time, you have been raised by your parents, you've had role models as teachers, they have created the good feeling in your stomach, so anything that is different will feel bad. But what we feel and what we do in an organizational context is very different. We can act against our values. Why would we do that? Simple. We either get paid enough, we get enough exposure, we get enough status. I'm Dutch, that means I don't like to work in the weekend. But still I do. Well, because I get the reward for it. Either financially or content-wise. So what I feel and what I do are two different things. And that is the same for all of us. Now, ideally, as an organization, we find ways of working that build upon the natural values people have. So you have positive energy reinforcement. People work the way they like to work, which means they work harder. Now, coming to Vision 2030, a few questions. One of the pillars is about making Saudi a place where immigrants can also find their way into Saudi society. Now the question there is, are we talking about integration or assimilation? The difference being, do we want people to be like Saudi, or do we want them to reinforce Saudi ways? Philosophically, this has to do with, do we believe that our societies are like ships, which means we can change course quite quickly? Or do we believe that our societies are like the coast, and therefore much more grounded? And again, there's no answer here. There's just a philosophical reflection. The point being is that if we want to change values, we need to start thinking about who are our role models? Who are the heroes? What are the practices that resemble what we want to have more of in the future? Because we can implement a lot of policies, but if we don't change how we live these policies, social change will take much more time. Different dimensions have an impact here. So if we think about societal impact, how do we relate to authority figures? If people come from societies where authority figures are basically non-existent, being, for example, the Nordics or the Anglo-Saxon world, relating to this power difference is a very difficult thing because we do not have a natural feeling for it. If we talk about group behavior, inclusivity versus privileges, are we all similar, or are we a bit more similar depending on the group in which we interact? If we talk about Arabization, how do we work and balance affirmative actions with local employment? So do we want to get more locals into managerial jobs? What is the message that we're giving to non-locals? And is that an intended message, or is it not? And again, consciousness is the key here. And work-life balance. Most of the world is rather, call it success, material success oriented. Being Dutch, Nordic, we're not. And that means that if we talk about the best work-life balance, the most innovative cultures, countries, and in terms of the most competitive economies, you will find that typically countries where material success is not the main driver score higher. Now let's reflect on this. If we think about work-life balance, what does work-life balance really mean? Does that mean that you study in private time or during work time? So if I'm an employer and I want you to develop, and I tell you I'll sponsor it, but you do it in your own time, it's costing me family time. So I am the one making the investment, not the company. And again, there's no right or wrong, but this is the consideration that we need to have to create a consistent narrative between what we say and what we do. So if we want to create more innovation, innovation needs the ability to make mistakes. If in our organization we punish those who make mistakes, what is the message that we're giving? Don't make mistakes. But how can we innovate if we don't make mistakes? So, also in terms of promotion criteria, be conscious about who is being promoted and when. And be conscious about when can you take risks, because in some business areas you don't want people to innovate. If we think about accounting and we think about Enron, they were very creative, very innovative, but they no longer exist. So be conscious about when you can and need innovation and not use it as a buzzword. If we talk about employment, there was a study done in the US, repeated quite a few times, on what makes successful sports teams. These are not the teams that have only the best players. Typically, a team of A-list players does not result in an A-list team, unless they work as a team and not as a collection of highly gifted individuals. The challenge in managing a very diverse environment, whether it is gender or age or nationality, is that it has to do with the Gauss curve. On average, any monocultural team, whether that be culture or gender, etc., is typically kind of effective because people know to anticipate the behaviors. But it will never be as effective, as productive, as fast as a well-led, diverse team. Simply because that diversity in mindset creates different insights, which allows more adaptability. Now, I don't have a drawing board here, otherwise I would have drawn you a picture of, if you make this curve you see in front of you narrower, what happens is that it'll get higher as you push the edges towards the middle, right? What happens with such a highly specialized team? It can be very effective unless the landscape has changed, in which case it will fall over much faster because it does not have a wide enough base to deal with situations that are very different from the norm. And if there's one thing that ties us all together, whether we're in the kingdom, in any other country, in business, in academic life, is that the world changes faster and faster. And that's why a more diverse team offers you much more adaptability to deal with these changes. Now, these differences in mental programming between countries can be visualized. And in front of you, you have an example of a few countries that are involved in the NEOM project. So here we have Germany, Japan, Jordan, and the Kingdom. And very quickly, we can already see that, for example, the first dimension, dealing with hierarchy, the boss, I believe, is either Japanese or German of the project manager. So we will run into issues with authority. We will run into issues with delegation. The second dimension has to do with how do we make people feel included. Typically, in more individualistic societies, inclusion is not one of the main things we focus on. It's task orientation, not relationship orientation. So if the team is not creating enough feelings of inclusion, the chances are again that that's an area where people will leave. They don't feel included enough, etc., etc. Visualizing cultural differences in this way will allow you to very quickly identify upfront, where do I need to give more attention, as opposed to afterwards analyzing what went wrong. For those of you that work with recruitment, you will typically get lots of CVs. But what makes a successful CV? Typical Swedish CV. It is very factual, very to the point, very modest. Typical American resume. They're all the best. Typical Indian resume. Kind of modest, but a lot of name dropping. Different ways of writing good CVs. If we want to leverage these equally intelligently gifted, practically gifted people, how can we make sure that our recruiters understand that how we showcase our expertise is taken into account when we apply for a job? Because if recruiters are not trained in this, you will only hire Americans. Yeah. Another example. Let's take a project. Let's take two axes. On the one hand, the time it takes before an action is executed, and on the other hand, the time itself. So the typical German or Austrian way of doing things is that it takes a bit of time to analyze and then they execute. Then we look into the typical American or Indian way. It is action, reaction, action, reaction, trial and error. Learn by doing. Now let's have a look at people like me, the Dutch. We like to talk a lot. So we go back, we go forward. It's like a tango, back and forth, and we dance our way through the project. Now come the Belgian, the French, and also Saudi. Because initially we need to figure out who has the actual authority. It'll take some time before we can get started. Because Saudi culture is quite analytical, it'll take some time for us before we can digest all the details. We need to do different hypotheses, so it takes time. And then we execute. Now, the point being is, we all get there. We all start somewhere and we all end somewhere. But what happens now if I have an American project manager that manages a Saudi team, and the Saudi team takes 3-4 weeks to analyze and doesn't communicate in between because they feel there's nothing to communicate? The American will get impatient and think, oh, you're lazy, you're incompetent. The Saudis will think about the American, you're lazy and incompetent because you want to go too fast. How do you bridge these differences? Simple. Agree up front what is the approach we're going to take. Agree up front that we communicate every single week, even if there is no progress. Then we just communicate that there is no progress. And we take the assumptions away. These are very, very basic tips on how to get cross-cultural teams to work better together. The essence is communication in terms of how often do we communicate, what do we communicate, and what do we do if there's nothing to communicate? We still communicate. Because even when you don't talk, you're talking. Now, if we talk about internationalization, again, let's go back to basic. We all have meetings. Lots of them. Have we ever carefully taken the time to reflect on what does having a meeting really mean? What is the purpose of a meeting? What makes a successful meeting? In the Anglo-Saxon world, kind of small, so I'll read it up. A meeting is a place where you exchange meaningful information in order to come to a decision. The decision is the goal. You basically have very clear, smart objectives, typically communicated up front. Now let's go to the Germanic market. There, it's only for the experts. Only experts that actually have factual knowledge are invited to participate. There's a clear agenda, shared up front. You do not deviate from the agenda. If there's something on the agenda that it should be discussed, then you post it to the next meeting. Very much structured. It's about knowledge exchange. Now here come the Dutch. It's a platform to let people participate in the decision making. The decision is not the relevant thing. It's the feeling of being included in the decision. Very emotionally different. Everybody can speak up, everybody can join at any given time. If you want to change direction, you change direction, because it's about emotions and feelings. And then we have the Chinese way. A meeting is just for the purpose of letting the boss have a platform. The decision has already been made. The meeting is ceremonial. So if you want to influence the decision making in that context, you need to do it before the meeting, in the hallway. Understanding why we think differently about a concept of which we spend a lot of our time in work life already helps, again, to take away a lot of frustrations, because there's no right and wrong, again. What is it that we agree on? Now, before I finish up, we are engaged with the European Union to help European SMEs to internationalize. And what the EU found out is that for small and mid-sized enterprises, there are two barriers to successful internationalization: capital and culture. Because most SMEs are founded by and run by the founder, him or herself, they have a learning challenge, which is for the founder to admit that he or she doesn't know everything, and that what works and has made them successful in one country might not necessarily work in the other country. So cultural knowledge is quite important. And why is that? Because if you look at managers' global challenges, culture is one of the main issues. And that's because until they've met us, they could not make it tangible. It is one of the most profitable changes you can make, because if you manage teams well, you can get basically up to 14% more black profit after taxes, etc. If you don't take it into account, you will be one of the 70 to 80% of companies that will fail when merging or acquiring another company. Most of it is due to cultural challenges. And basically, if you just want to make your own life easier when managing intercultural teams, understanding the why will help to make your life easier. So, to wrap it up, help or use cultural knowledge to understand your own programming, understand where are your emotional barriers, understand where are the barriers for your organization, and then start making it explicit. And if we talk about organizations, one dimension, as you mentioned, is about effectiveness. Now, every organization will say it wants to be goal-oriented. But let's reflect on that for a moment. This dimension has multiple ranges, left to the right. What is goal orientation in terms of functionality for Facebook is very different than it should be for a nuclear power plant or an oil platform. We might all remember the Gulf accident in the Texan Gulf with British Petroleum. To all likelihood, and we haven't measured it, so it's an assumption, their management focus was so production focused that they forgot one very important thing: safety. Safety first. Volkswagen and the Dieselgate. It was not an isolated happening with people faking the numbers, because it happened in all parts of the organization. Volkswagen, Audi, etc. So it was a culture that focused on passing the test, very goal-oriented, but again, not effective. So what is effective and what feels good are two very different things. If you study management and you're in charge of developing your organization, normally what I'm going to show you next will sound familiar. We look at regional differences. So we have our region North America, we might have the region Latin America, we have Europe, if we add the Middle East to it, we have EMEA, we've got Africa, we've got APAC, we might add Japan to it. This is how most organizations structure their business, which might have made sense in the age of production, because a lot of regions have cheaper wages, so it makes more sense to produce there. But where are we moving now? We're moving to information economies, we're moving to service economies. And in service, emotional understanding is critical. Now let's put the cultural map. What we can see is that the former regional way of deviating our organizations doesn't make any cultural sense whatsoever. So if you are in charge, reflect about where do I find emotional similarities, because that's where business will be easiest in terms of actual working together. Now, the last slide, if you're into marketing, is never one dimension. If we take the Middle East as a region and we take Japan, both score very highly on uncertainty avoidant. But the Middle East scores short-term oriented and Japan scores long-term oriented. This means that in your marketing, there will be a very different focus on how quickly will people try things out if you launch a new product or service. If they've tried it out once and it didn't work, will they try it again? Or is it, sorry, failed me once, you're done? That means more preparation time because you don't want to fail. It means about how long does it take before it gets picked up in society. Now, Saudi is also an interesting market because people try to like to try things out. But to change a habit takes much more time. And that means that if you plan your marketing budget, initial success does not mean success. It just means people like it. But if they want to keep using it, you need to keep marketing. So culture also has an impact on how do you launch new products, new services, and market them. With that being said, thank you. Do we have any time for questions? Yeah, we have some time for questions. So there's a question up there in the back. If we can get a microphone over there.
Okay. Thank you very much for a very informative lecture. I think always in society, in different society, the challenge is in simulating. The simulation is the most challenging factor. And you see that in different societies, that people immigrate and they always have their own world and their own environment. How do you overcome it? Because it does, when it grows, it creates a lot of problems.
So if you think about silo formation inside societies, one structural element you can use is urban planning. If people live physically apart from each other, then they will live mentally apart from each other. If people go to different, let's say, football clubs or swimming clubs or any hobby club, and they only meet with their own bubble, they don't get exposed to other ways of thinking. So urban planning, social planning, in basically getting people to interact more, will be one way of exposing people at an earlier age to different ways of doing things. And because when we're young, we're much more formable, we're pliable. So if we start at a young age by giving that experience to people, then that is one way of basically getting people to be exposed to differences. And once they've been exposed to differences once at a young age, it'll be easier at an older age to try out adapting behavior. Now, my understanding, for example, here at the university is that there's an active push to get students to go out and to try explore new things. My suggestion there is, even at a younger age, we could try to explore. When kids are 15, 16, send them abroad for a while so they can pick up new ideas. Because by the time we're 20, 25, we're already much more settled in our way of thinking. So urban planning, social planning is one way of basically creating people's a more flexible mindset towards being exposed to and dealing with differences.
Culture has a lot to do with.
Yes.
How to deal with culture.
Well, because culture is shaped by the role models that we have, allowing universities, schools to engage in that interaction, allowing, for example, the promotion of teachers that explore differences as opposed to sticking to a right-wrong mentality, will help to shape also our kids' mind that what you do is important as long as you do it with respect. And respect for the difference. I would say that's one way of helping, with young kids especially, to start changing their mind. Reflect on the teaching behavior.
How do you control the stereotype that sets in your mind?
Stereotyping, yeah, how we deal with it is basically we position culture as a risk management tool.
And that basically means that every way of thinking, every way of working has pros and benefits. And the exercise that I can give all of you is that when you look at a certain behavior and you think it's weird, ask yourself why. First question. Second, how can I use it? So let's say on a company level, a company says we have a strong culture. Sounds good. Well, it's not good if you want to get people in that think differently. So what is good and the negative downside of it That's the constant reflection that you need to have, that if you see a behavior and you think it's bad, why is it bad? If you think it's good, why is it good?
Culture compass.
Yeah.
Reflect on the culture compass too.
Yeah, so in terms of helping to visualize cultural differences for students as well, we offer students the possibility, also academic lecturers for that matter, to reflect on their own values, the value preferences, better said, and what is the impact of those value preferences on communicating with other cultures. So making culture visible is one way of doing that.
Thank you so much for a very enlightening and beneficial lecture on Imam Yahya and the Vice of the Women's Campus. Where is that fine line between assimilation and acculturation, where I want to be more diverse and learn about other cultures, but at the same time, when you were speaking about the children and sending them out at an early age, that it might turn to acculturation, where they might just change their views drastically and change. So there's that fine line. How can I find that fine line between the two?
It's a very challenging question.
I would say that in general, because cultural change takes generations. And the reason for this is that I have kids of my own, and I raise my kids in a certain way. At the same time, I also have my parents, which are involved in their life. I've got my wife, I've got my wife's parents, we've got the schooling system, we've got the hobbies. So even if I change my way of parenting, I don't need to be afraid that my kids will become uncontrollable, because I know society will still keep you in check. Now, if as a society I want to change kids' behavior, then I need to address parenting behavior. I need to address teaching style. So I need to, on multiple fronts, change how kids' mentalities and values are installed in them. And unless you do it consistently, changes will take actually multiple generations. So because culture is such a deeply ingrained value, it takes time to change. We don't need to be afraid that if we change one concept in their life, that all of a sudden they will be very different. I have a question over here, behind you, I think. The microphone. One question over here.
Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. My question, my name is Egnar Shahawi, I am the Vice Dean of the College of Law. My question is the following, especially that you speak about the culture, which is that means it is a very interesting topic and very broad topic. And then when you define it, you said that it is, of course, unwritten rules, and this is I can say that it is a general definition of culture, that these are unwritten rules which become, that means unwritten customs, you can say, customs which become rules at the end and binding to the individuals. So my question is the introduction of new technologies nowadays and the social media. Did they bridge the differences in cultures, especially the differences in these cultures, and it made easier the integration and adaptation in other societies? This is my question. The second observance is the security of data. Security of data, confidentiality, and all these words, which are big words, when in terms now of the states and the individuals. Do you think that these new technologies help to make this data, or this confidentiality of data, more, that means when we speak about confidentiality, it differs from one state to another, and what is the sensitive data that you think that it will be, for example, against the culture of one state or another? These are my two questions.
So the first question in terms of, does new technology create one world culture? Because there's a lot of talk about it with Facebook and LinkedIn, etc. Actually, no, it does exactly the opposite. And one reason you can see this, that in more and more cultures and countries, there is a rise of nationalism. And that is because for most people, when they get exposed to things that are different, and they get exposed to things that are different via new technology, they go back to basic. Because differences are scary for most people, especially if you don't operate with them day to day. So, no, new technology does not create one way of thinking. It actually, to the contrary, reinforces bubbles. Because we can choose the news we read. We can choose the groups we interact with. And that actually leads to more silo formation, not less, unfortunately. From my perspective, because through all these so-called smart algorithms, we get fed more of the stuff we seem to like. And by that action, we don't get exposed anymore to things that are different to us. So that's a personal opinion in the sense that I don't necessarily think that the new technology helps to bridge differences. It's unfortunately more and more used to create polarization, which leads to less willingness to understand the other side. The other question on data security, most companies are really good at implementing policies and structures and processes, but what they forget is the mindset. They don't focus on how do we deal with these processes and systems. Because if we are not aware of that information is sensitive and why is it sensitive, then either we don't take it in serious at all, or we go completely overboard and we don't share anything. So also there, unless we create that balanced understanding of what is needed to protect and why, we risk basically foregoing the understanding. And by foregoing the understanding, we don't leverage technologies as well as we could. So I hope that answered the questions. Thank you.
Thank you for the informative lecture. Just my question is concerning the organized media campaign. Can it have, especially if it's long-lasting organized media campaign, can it have a major effect on the culture, change some of these values? Because I feel sometimes what we consider bad, we might consider it good later on after this campaign. And if so, I believe governments, they can change the whole culture with time, change a lot in the culture, a lot of things in the culture.
Media can be used for multiple purposes. And of course, when we reinforce a certain message in media all the time, it will have an impact over time. And especially if it is not balanced by parenting and by schooling, then there is a bigger risk that media can be used to that effect. So it's again awareness about how is media being used, to which extent does it force people in a certain way of thinking, to which extent does it allow people to understand the differences.
I'm suggesting that the media might affect layers, but not the core.
Media initially, like technology, will to all likelihood have an impact on the outer layers, because media shapes who are our role models, who are our symbols.
Okay.
But it'll take a long time before that trickles down to the core, the values, because our parents have slightly more impact on how we relate to certain things than the media does. Our teachers have more impact than the media does.
Organized media, for example, the government is looking to wants to change some of these values or aspects of the culture. I think with the long-lasting campaign, it might have an impact.
If we think about one of the pillars, entrepreneurship, if the media, for example, in Saudi would showcase more and more examples of successful entrepreneurs from Saudi that have been very successful in growing their business international, even when making mistakes, then slowly but surely you'll impact the relationship people have to being self-employed, which in Saudi is not yet necessarily seen as a positive thing. You will slowly but surely impact the focus on, okay, so in order to innovate, we need to fail sometimes. But how we deal with the failure, that is what tells us can we be innovative or not. So yes, if a country wishes to go into a certain direction, for example, become more entrepreneurial as a society, then media can be leveraged to, over time, trickle down these layers of the onion to showcase that it's okay sometimes to fail, as long as you learn. It's okay to be self-employed, as long as you also add value to not just yourself, but wider society. So yes, it can be done, but it'll take time.
Yes, thank you for a wonderful presentation. I'm Dr. George Thomas, the Chairman of the Department of Marketing. You have given in your last slide also an implication for marketing. Say you said that in Saudi Arabia an initial success does not really mean a true success, or it does not guarantee future success. Whereas if it's in Japan, that's a different case. What I'm afraid is this culture these days is spreading all over the world because of a variety of reasons. You said, for example, about Nokia. See, Nokia was the darling of the masses for all over the world, everywhere in the world, and all of a sudden, when a new technology has been brought up by, say, iPhone, Apple, the smartphone technology, when it was brought in, altogether Nokia has become, unwanted in the whole world. So these days, say, business success is a short-term success. I have worked on a paper called Decline of Permanence and Chinese Wave. This was my idea. Decline of permanence in Chinese Wave. In the past, when you were buying things, you were buying for a long duration. If you buy a television, that was for at least 5 to 10 years' time. Right now, when you buy a television, when you buy a computer, you are buying it for 2-3 years maximum. So because of this, I believe these days, the initial success is the only success. Take the example of Sony. Sony was the best in televisions or in electronics all over the world, and right now it's not so much, it's not able to keep that lead. So everywhere these days, business success means short-term success. Do you agree?
I agree to a certain extent. I think from a marketing perspective, of course, it matters, do we talk about durables or consumables? If we want to create a new, let's say, well, I can use the example of Kit Kat in Japan. It was sold in supermarkets at a low discount, but it was much more expensive. So the setting wasn't explicit and, let's call it, value added enough for the Japanese. So they created specific Kit Kat stores in which they sold the Kit Kat as a premium, as an experience. That basically meant that if they would have initially, by failing sales figures, decided, okay, it's not worth our while, they would have missed a huge market. So it just matters what we mean with that statement, initial success doesn't guarantee success in markets that are short-term oriented. It means that you need to differentiate your planning. If you want to stay relevant, you need to, for example, launch a new iPhone every 2 to 3 years. Well, actually every year nowadays. Because the moment you stop, it hasn't changed the habit. The habit is the short-term buying behavior. So it depends on the product we talk about, it depends on the market that we focus on. So I agree that markets or companies that market products that are more short-term lived, they need to constantly pump out new materials to keep people to buy. But a car, you don't buy every year. A house, you don't buy every year. Your children's beds, you don't buy every year. So it depends on the product that we're talking about in terms of what do we use as the measure for success of a launch campaign or a marketing campaign. So to some extent I agree, to some extent I must disagree.
Hello, hi. Thank you for such an informative lecture. I'm Tim, I'm from the architecture department. My question is that you were mentioning how culture is such an intangible aspect, and you showed us how you measured it and there was the data. So how do you use that data on a day-to-day basis?
So from our perspective, how do we use it? We make culture tangible on a personal level. So we have
an application which we call the Culture Compass, which allows every individual to measure their personal cultural preferences compared to a country of choice or countries of choice, and depending on the role they have. Because in academic setting, for example, if you're a teacher or student, there are slight differences. So we help to make that tangible, and like with the man and the mouse exercise, once you have read that there are certain likelihoods for behavioral tendencies to occur, then when they happen, it will be in the back of your head that, okay, it's culture. So you automatically take a step back and you don't get into personal discussions. You understand it's a wider phenomenon. Or, if it's already happened, you understand why it happened. So that, on a day-to-day level, for a lot of people, makes life a bit more easy, because we all have questions of why are things happening. On an organizational level, we typically always interact with organizations that have strategic challenges, for example, to become more innovative, to become more productive or creative. That's where we visualize it. If we talk about architecture, office design has a huge link to cultural dynamics. Because in any society that is more hierarchical, the power holder, the boss, typically has his or her own office. In the Nordics, if they say we go open office, everybody, including the boss, goes open office. If we talk about creating more team atmosphere, okay, open office can be useful. But if you want people to focus, don't give them an open office. So we help to bring that cultural element to day-to-day working practices. So every day depends, is it an organization, is it an individual? It always starts by understanding where are we now and where do we need to go.
Just one last question. When we examine or analyze communication, because you've brought communication in quite a bit, or discourse patterns, if you will, from a variety of cultures, I happen to teach discourse analysis. So my students often ask me, is language culture, or is culture expressed via language? Now, I have my opinion, but I'd like to know your opinion.
It's actually a catch-22 question. Certain cultures have certain ways of speaking, and that way of speaking can predict a more analytical approach to life. So in, for example, Arab, context is quite important. That's why you can see that Arab language is quite contextual. If I think about Finnish language, it's very contextual. So both these countries, they score more highly uncertainty avoidant. If we talk about languages such as Japanese, again, also highly contextual. So the question is, does language follow culture? Does culture follow language? That, unfortunately, I don't have an answer to, but yes, there is an interaction. The main thing people would need to understand is that language does not equate culture. And the core example there is, for example, the Benelux, Belgium, Flanders, and the Netherlands both speak Dutch, but they're very different in terms of value preferences. Belgium, Flanders, very hierarchical, quite success-oriented. The Netherlands, the polar opposite. So there will be an interlink, but to which extent? The only thing I can say is that language does not equate culture, but there are links. Yeah.
Peter Sugar, my name. Thank you well for the information. I wanted to ask you, you just mentioned that culture is some kind of programming for the Professor Hofstede. I want to ask you what goes wrong with this programming in culture. You said that it can help the Saudi Arabia to integrate, to assimilate and all this information. What goes wrong in the European Union? Why do the core cultures collide there? Why there is no programming there? And why don't you introduce yourself as a European? Why do you introduce yourself as a Dutch person?
So if I reflect on the EU for a very long time decided that to talk about group programming would be to reinforce national identities. And the European Union is trying to bridge national identities to forge a European identity. So there was a political element to why individual national differences were basically not highlighted. Now, in the last, I'd say, maybe 5-6 years, the EU has turned around, at least to my understanding and observation, whereby there's more and more understanding that within the EU specifically, the strength is the diversity. Well, Brexit can be explained, we don't have answers to all questions, but Brexit can be explained that, to all likelihood, the way the Remain party communicated made the Leave party or people feel excluded. They were not felt taken seriously. And that in a low hierarchical context is not a positive thing. So it was basically a punishment for the elite. That's one of the explanations for Brexit. And the other reason why Brexit doesn't like, or the UK, you could say, had a special relationship with the EU, was that the EU was much more about consensus. And that's not a very Anglo-Saxon concept.
Wasn't it more about the fear of, let's say, Polish workforce taking the work position for the British?
I would say that the fear for foreign invasion is typically, in any culture, any country, a geopolitical tool that can be used for good or for bad.
All right, well, thank you very much for something that we all needed to think about and reflect on. May I call on our rector to show our appreciation?
Thank you.
Thank you very